Frank was born Annelies or Anneliese Marie Frank on June 12, 1929 in Frankfurt, Germany, to Otto Frank, 1889–1980, and Edith Frank Hollander, 1945. She had one elder sister named Margot, 1926–45. The Franks were liberal Jews, and did not observe all of the customs and traditions of Judaism, and lived in an assimilated community of Jewish and non-Jewish citizens of various religions. Edith Frank was the more devout parent, while Otto Frank was interested in scholarly pursuits and had an extensive library. Both parents encouraged the children to read. On the morning of August 4, 1944, following a tip from an informer who has never been identified, the Achterhuis was stormed by a group of German uniformed police, Grünpolizei, led by SS Oberskarführer Karl Silberbauer of the Sicherheitsdienst. The Franks, Van Pelzes, and Pfeffer were taken to RSHA headquarters, where they were interrogated and held overnight. On August 5 they were transferred to the Huis van Bewering, House of Detention, an overcrowded prison on the Wetteringschans. 2 days later they were transported to the Westerbork transit camp, through which by that time more than 100,000 Jews, mostly Dutch and German, had passed. Having been arrested in hiding, they were considered criminals and sent to the punishment barracks for hard labor. In her book describing the betrayal and transportation to Auschwitz of her own family, Eva Schloss, whose mother Elfriede Mutti Geringer married Otto Frank after the war, tells of the trial of Nazi collaborator Miep Brams. Brams was the girlfriend of a Dutch resistance worker called Jans Hahn, and she was supposed to be helping him protect Jews and help the resistance. As the war progressed, Hahn became suspicious that his girlfriend was really a double agent for the Nazis. An awful lot of the Jewish families he entrusted to her were vanishing without trace, or being rounded up. When she became aware of his suspicions, Brams betrayed Hahn to the Gestapo, and he was executed. It was later estimated that Miep Brams was responsible for betraying as many as 200 Jewish families, including ours. In April 1949, Brams received a sentence of 6 years. Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman were arrested and jailed at the penal camp for enemies of the regime at Amersfoort. Kleiman was released after 7 weeks, but Kugler was held in various work camps until the war's end. Miep Gies and Bep Foskoagel were questioned and threatened by the security police but not detained. They returned to the Achterhuis the following day, and found Anne's papers strewn on the floor. They collected them, as well as several family photograph albums, and Gies resolved to return them to Anne after the war. On August 7, 1944, Gies attempted to facilitate the release of the prisoners by confronting Silberbauer and offering him money to intervene, but he refused. In 2015, a book by the Flemish journalist Jeroen de Bruyne and Bep Foskoagel's youngest son, Joop van Wijck, alleged that Nelly Foskoagel, Bep's younger sister, may have betrayed Anne Frank's family. The authors found evidence that included that Nelly Foskoagel was a Nazi collaborator. She died in 2001. On September 3, 1944, the group was deported on what would be the last transport from Westerbork to the Auschwitz concentration camp and arrived after a 3-day journey. On the same train was Bloem Evers Emden, an Amsterdam native who had befriended Margot and Anne in the Jewish Lyceum in 1941. Bloem saw Anne, Margot, and their mother regularly in Auschwitz, and was interviewed for her remembrances of the Frank women in Auschwitz in the television documentary The Last 7 Months of Anne Frank, 1988, by Dutch filmmaker Willy Lindwer, and the BBC documentary Anne Frank Remembered, 1995. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, the SS forcibly separated the men from the women and children, and Otto Frank was wrenched from his family. Those deemed able to work were admitted into the camp, and those deemed unfit for labor were immediately killed. Of the 1,019 passengers, 549 including all children younger than 15 were sent directly to the gas chambers. Anne Frank, who had turned 15 3 months earlier, was one of the youngest people to be spared from her transport. She was soon made aware that most people were gassed upon arrival and never learned that the entire group from the Achterhoe's had survived this selection. She reasoned that her father, in his mid-50s and not particularly robust, had been killed immediately after they were separated. With the other females not selected for immediate death, Frank was forced to strip naked to be disinfected, had her head shaved, and was tattooed with an identifying number on her arm. By day, the women were used as slave labor and Frank was forced to haul rocks and dig rolls of sod. By night, they were crammed into overcrowded barracks. Some witnesses later testified Frank became withdrawn and tearful when she saw children being led to the gas chambers. Others reported that more often she displayed strength and courage. Her gregarious and confident nature allowed her to obtain extra bread rations for her mother, sister, and herself. Disease was rampant. Before long, Frank's skin became badly infected by scabies. The Frank sisters were moved into an infirmary, which was in a state of constant darkness and infested with rats and mice. Edith Frank stopped eating, saving every morsel of food for her daughters and passing her rations to them through a hole she made at the bottom of the infirmary wall. In October 1944, the Frank women were slated to join a transport to the Libau labor camp in Upper Silesia. Bloem Evers Emden was slated to be on this transport, but Anne was prohibited from going because she had developed scabies, and her mother and sister opted to stay with her. Bloem went on without them. On October 28, selections began for women to be relocated to Bergen-Belsen. More than 8,000 women, including Anne and Margot Frank, and Augusta van Pels, were transported. Edith Frank was left behind and later died from starvation. Tents were erected at Bergen-Belsen to accommodate the influx of prisoners, and as the population rose, the death toll due to disease increased rapidly. Frank was briefly reunited with two friends, Hannelie Goslar and Nanette Blitz, who were confined in another section of the camp. Goslar and Blitz survived the war, and later discussed the brief conversations they had conducted with Frank through a fence. Blitz described Anne as bald, emaciated, and shivering. Goslar noted Augusta van Pels was with Anne and Margot Frank, and was caring for Margot, who was severely ill. Neither of them saw Margot, as she was too weak to leave her bunk. Anne told Blitz and Goslar she believed her parents were dead, and for that reason she did not wish to live any longer. Goslar later estimated their meetings had taken place in late January or early February 1945. In early 1945, a typhus epidemic spread through the camp, killing 17,000 prisoners. Other diseases, including typhoid fever, were rampant. Due to these chaotic conditions, it is not possible to say what ultimately caused Anne's death. Witnesses later testified Margot fell from her bunk in her weakened state and was killed by the shock. Anne died a few days after Margot. The exact dates of Margot and Anne's deaths were not recorded. It was long thought that their deaths occurred only a few weeks before British soldiers liberated the camp on April 15, 1945, but new research in 2015 indicated that they may have died as early as February of that year. Among other evidence, witnesses recalled that the Franks displayed typhus symptoms by February 7, and Dutch health authorities reported that most untreated typhus victims died within 12 days of their first symptoms. After liberation, the camp was burned in an effort to prevent further spread of disease. The sisters were buried in a mass grave at an unknown location. After the war, it was estimated that only 5,000 of the 107,000 Jews deported from the Netherlands between 1942 and 1944 survived. An estimated 30,000 Jews remained in the Netherlands, with many people aided by the Dutch underground. Approximately two-thirds of this group survived the war. Otto Frank survived his internment in Auschwitz. After the war ended, he returned to Amsterdam, where he was sheltered by January and Miep Gies as he attempted to locate his family. He learned of the death of his wife, Edith, in Auschwitz, but remained hopeful that his daughters had survived. After several weeks, he discovered Margot and Anne had also died. He attempted to determine the fates of his daughter's friends and learned many had been murdered. Suzanne's son Letterman, often mentioned in Anne's diary, had been gassed along with her parents. Her sister, Barbara, a close friend of Margot's, had survived. Several of the Frank sisters' school friends had survived, as had the extended families of Otto and Edith Frank, as they had fled Germany during the mid-1930s, with individual family members settling in Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States.